Hello and welcome to Press TV News Analysis. I'm Kavit Hafwai. The uprisings and revolutions from North Africa to the Middle East each have their own dynamics. Yet the West seems to take exceptions in cases where violence is involved, which begs the question, what criteria does the U.S. and its allies use to separate Libya and its dictator compared to, let's say, Yemen or Bahrain, where those regimes have exercised brute force, such as targeting wounded anti-government protesters in Bahrain's case, while denying them crucial medical care. Well, to discuss that more, we have human rights lawyer Amjad Salfiti, who joins us from London. We have editor of the Pan-African Newswire, Abayomi Azikiwe from Troy, Michigan, and also co-founder of the Crescent and Cross Solidarity Movement, Mark Glenn, who joins us on the phone from Coeur d'Alene. I want to thank all my guests. Let me start with Mark Glenn. Mark Glenn, let's begin with Libya. A UN resolution under the pretext of saving civilian lives, 40 nations involved, $1 billion spent and counting. What makes Libya different than other countries?
Very simply, it's in the United States' interest and the other Western powers to intervene in this thing militarily. We should not make the mistake for a second of assuming that this is based on humanitarianism or the desire to see democracy and human rights spread throughout the region. This is simply an imperial move aimed at establishing and maintaining the decades-long hegemony over the area that the West has enjoyed now for some time. And it could be 40 nations, it could be 40,000 nations, it wouldn't make any difference. These numbers are just illusions. It's just part of the stagecraft that the West is using in order to try to maintain some air of legitimacy about this. But in general, it is no different in its basic substance as the invasion and destruction of Iraq, of Afghanistan, or even of Israel's destruction of Gaza back in 2 years ago with Operation Cast Lead, or with Lebanon in 2006. There are always flimsy excuses that the aggressors use in order to justify their mass murder with high-sounding phrases such as humanitarianism and, of course, trying to legitimize all of this through the United Nations. But in general, it's just plain, brute, mafia-type tactics and thuggery.
Let's turn our attention to the London conference. Amjad Salfiti, a new contact group was announced to map out Libya's political future, even its future leaders. A question comes up, how can that be done while Libya is in the midst of a revolution and, of course, you have that fluid situation on the ground?
I think the right question that should have been asked is how can that be done with the exclusion of delegates representing the interim government, on the interim national council that is currently representing Libyan people and interests. In any case, I believe neither is correct, and that is not how the destiny of nations is decided. The correct way is if some sort of intervention or some sort of military assistance is needed, then to provide that, but to stay as far away and at arm's length from making decisions on behalf of that nation. Because I think this is an issue that relates to sovereignty, and once you intervene in sovereignty, no matter under what excuse you do it, you are really intervening in internal affairs of a state, into the destiny of the people, and that is not democracy. That is, a matter of fact, that is totally contrary to the doctrine of democracy. So I think what we are seeing here is under the pretext of humanitarian aid, roadmaps, and so on. One is seeing 40 nations intervening in how Libya should be formed, the new Libya should be formed. And that is, again, a sort of domination which is akin with, if you like, colonization, or possibly some sort of indirect occupation of a country, which ought to be prevented. I think the Libyan people will wake up at some stage in the very near future to find that much of what is naturally their national right is being hijacked by nations who are really interested in their oil and not in their well-being.
Well, the problem is that you have a transitional national council that had representatives invited to this conference in London. They were not allowed to partake in the conference itself, but they were there. And you have also the efforts being led by France. The U.S. has not recognized formally the National Council, but they're courting them with financial support, as the U.S. Secretary of State stated. They're thinking of arming them with arms of a variety of kinds, of which they say they have not done that yet. And I want to focus on the point that you made. Even is this Transitional National Council representative of the people of Libya, all mounting to them trying to make sure that they're shaping Libya's political future?
That is very much the case. I mean, even the Transitional National Assembly or the interim government for Libya is in itself hardly tested from a democratic point of view. It's hardly representative. I mean, all what we have to ask ourselves, who is this interim government? And we find that most of the people who are heading this National Council are ex-Gaddafi, if you like, officials who have really sort of placed themselves into a position of leadership in this very crucial time. I think in any event, it is right to discuss how to assist Libyan needs at the present moment, which are mainly no-fly zones, and to stay away from intervention or fully pledged intervention on the ground. It is not right, however, to actually start deciding and making decisions and creating roadmaps into how the future Libya should look like, regardless of the fact that, and you are right, there was a delegation which had an observer status in the conference in London, and they were, as a matter of fact, excluded from contributing to the National Assembly and were met on side and marginal sort of meetings. But that by itself does show that maybe they did not want to hear any voice, regardless of how democratic that voice or how representative that voice from Libya was.
Let me bring in Mr. Azikiwe. Mr. Azikiwe, we're going to look at violence now. Violence is violence, especially when international law is broken. I want to give an example. Tear gas that breaks down the immune system used on peaceful protests, or putting a siege on a hospital while preventing doctors to attend the wounded. I'm talking about Bahrain. Why is Bahrain's case different than Libya?
Because Bahrain is the home of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, and the Pentagon has strategic interests in that nation. They do not want any type of change of administration there, whereas in Iraq and whereas in other parts of the world, there was oil, there were governments, there were militaries that were not totally under control of the United States, and therefore they were targeted for regime change. Their countries were targeted for total destruction. And if we look at the situation that's developing right now in Libya, it harkens back to the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885, where the European imperialist countries sat down and actually carved up a map, a geographical outlay for the African continent, which reigned for nearly a century. And even today, we're still suffering as a result of the decisions that were made in Berlin in 1884 and 1885. So I think it's clearly a question of the strategic and monetary and economic interests of the United States, why they are targeting Libya for not only regime change, but also for seizure of their oil fields, for their natural gas resources, and also to have a beachhead for AFRICOM right in the northern part of Africa on the Mediterranean.
Mark Lendo, the question comes to mind, how much longer can the United States do this? Let's reflect on what Barack Obama has said. While our military mission is focused on saving lives, we continue the goal of a Libya that belongs not to a dictator, but to its people. I mean, this balance of democratic ideals, we could even talk about Egypt and Tunisia in that case, with military interests. For how much longer can the U.S. use this balance, especially when it comes to a case like Bahrain, where these human rights violations are taking place?